5 of America's most respected doctors stood in front of cameras and declared the same verdict. The billionaire's 8-year-old son would never hear another sound for the rest of his life. Irreversible nerve damage, they said. Medical science had reached its limit. They were all wrong. But the person who would prove them wrong wasn't another doctor. She wasn't a specialist flown in from some prestigious hospital. She was a 52-year-old black woman who cleaned toilets and swept floors in the Sterling mansion, invisible to everyone who mattered. What Grace Monroe pulled from that boy's ear that night would be captured on camera in front of 50 witnesses and 2.4 million live-stream viewers. The object was alive. It had been living inside the child's head for 5 years, and when it finally emerged, wriggling and covered in blood, it would expose a conspiracy so twisted that even the FBI couldn't believe it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story begins 48 hours earlier in the silence before the storm. Grace Monroe's alarm pierced the darkness at 6 in the morning, 48 hours before the gala. She woke in her attic room in the Sterling mansion, a space barely larger than a closet, with a single window overlooking the servants' parking lot. She knelt on the worn carpet and pulled a metal box from beneath the floorboards. Inside lay the remnants of her former life. A medical diploma from Johns Hopkins, the name Dr. Grace Monroe embossed in gold letters, dated 1998. A newspaper clipping from 2015, The Child Whisperer Saves Conjoined Twins, with a photograph of Grace in surgical scrubs, younger, radiant. Another clipping from 2019, Renowned surgeon's son dies during emergency procedure. And finally, a photograph of Grace holding her 12-year-old son David at a hospital charity event, both smiling. Grace's fingers traced David's face as the memory crashed over her. December 14, 2019. David choking at dinner, his face purple, hands clawing at his throat. Anaphylactic shock from a hidden cashew. Grace grabbing her medical bag, her hands moving through the emergency cricothyrotomy she'd performed 200 times on other children. But David was hers, and her hands shook, and the blade went too deep, and she watched her son's carotid artery spray blood across the kitchen tiles while he looked into her eyes and died in 90 seconds. The medical board's verdict came 6 weeks later. Gross negligence, license suspended indefinitely. Grace closed the box and pushed it back. She dressed in her gray uniform and became invisible. The memory haunting her today happened 6 months ago. She'd been watching news in a shelter when she saw the press conference. Mount Sinai Hospital, 5 doctors behind a long table like judges. Dr. Robert Hayes, Chief of Medicine. Dr. Catherine Morrison, Neurologist. Dr. James Wu, Pediatric Surgeon. Dr. Sarah Klein, Audiologist. Dr. Richard Pemberton, ENT Specialist. After 4 years of testing, Dr. Hayes said, 12 MRIs, 8 CT scans, we have reached a unanimous conclusion. Alexander Sterling's auditory nerve shows complete degeneration. The damage is irreversible. Dr. Morrison added, we've consulted Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, Mass General. All agree surgical intervention would be futile. Dr. Klein delivered the final blow. In 30 years, I've never seen nerve damage this extensive in a child. Alexander Sterling will never hear. Not with current technology, not with cochlear implants, not with any treatment we know. Victoria Sterling sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes. So there's no hope? Dr. Pemberton shook his head. Your son will be profoundly deaf for life. We recommend sign language and adaptive technologies. Headlines screamed the next day, Billionaire's son sentenced to lifetime of silence. Victoria gave a tearful interview. Alexander will never hear me say I love you, but we'll give him the best life possible. Grace watched that conference 3 times. Something nagged at her. The way Victoria's tears didn't reach her eyes, the way the boy tracked conversations with his gaze, reading lips with desperate intensity, the way the diagnosis felt too neat, too final. So Grace applied for housekeeping at the Sterling estate, under false references. Maria Rodriguez, the head cook, hired her without checking because good help was hard to find. For 6 months, Grace watched. 3 days ago, while cleaning Victoria's bathroom, she found it. The prescription bottle in the trash. Ivermectin. For veterinary use only. Do not use it in humans. Refilled 2 weeks ago, third refill in a pattern going back years. Why would the stepmother of a deaf child need veterinary antiparasitics refilled for 5 consecutive years? Grace photographed it with her untraceable flip phone. She searched the cabinet. More ivermectin bottles spanning 5 years. Brazil travel documents from March 2019, Rio de Janeiro, 2 weeks before Alexander's 3rd birthday. Medical correspondence showing Dr. Pemberton recommending scans and surgery. Victoria declining everything. Too risky. Too invasive. Then Grace found the journal. Victoria's handwriting was precise, cold. March 15, 2019. Phase 1 complete. Boy is deaf. James suspects nothing. Timeline to inheritance. 10 years. November 3, 2024. Alex turns 18 in 2034. Must maintain devoted stepmother performance. Dr. Pemberton remains useful. His incompetence is an asset. Grace photographed every page. The bathroom door handle turned. Grace shoved the journal back, grabbed the toilet brush, started scrubbing. Victoria Sterling walked in, silk robe whispering against marble. "Grace, isn't it?" The quiet one. "Yes, ma'am," Grace said, eyes down. "Good. I like servants who know their place. Now get out." Grace left with her head bowed, but her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She knew now. She knew what Victoria had done to Alexander Sterling. And she knew if she didn't act soon, that child would die exactly as Victoria planned. She had 2 days to figure out how. The private medical wing occupied the entire east side of the Sterling Mansion's 2nd floor. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Grace scrubbed marble tiles near the examination room door when Dr. Pemberton arrived for Alexander's monthly checkup. James Sterling stood by the window checking his phone. Victoria sat on the leather sofa, legs crossed, face arranged in concerned devotion. Alexander perched on the examination table, small hands gripping the padded edge, eyes tracking every movement. Dr. Pemberton pulled out his otoscope with theatrical flourish. "Let's take a look, shall we?" He inserted it into Alexander's right ear, peered through the lens for 5 seconds, then withdrew. "Same as always," he announced. "The auditory nerve damage is permanent. We've tried every treatment available." James set down his phone. "What about those stem cell trials at Mayo Clinic?" Victoria's voice cut sharp. "Darling, we've discussed this. Alexander is too fragile for experimental procedures." Grace continued scrubbing the same tile, watching reflections in the chrome equipment stand. She'd seen Dr. Pemberton's examination. 5 seconds with a pen light. No tympanometry, no pressure tests, no actual diagnostics. And in that brief moment when light hit the right angle, Grace saw it. Movement. A tiny pulsing rhythm inside the ear canal. The words escaped before she could stop them. A whisper in Mandarin. Impossible. But the acoustics carried. Dr. Pemberton's head snapped toward her. Did the maid just speak? Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Grace, you're dismissed." Grace should have left, should have kept silent. But she looked at Alexander, and Alexander looked back with desperate, pleading eyes, and her body betrayed her. She stood. "Mr. Sterling, with respect, has Dr. Pemberton performed a tympanometry test?" The silence felt like the moment before a car crash. Dr. Pemberton's face flushed scarlet. "How dare you question my medical protocol? You're a house cleaner." Grace kept her eyes on James. A tympanometry would show foreign objects or blockages. Its standard diagnostic procedure takes 5 minutes. Victoria stood so fast her handbag hit the floor. "That's enough! James, fire this woman immediately!" James looked between them, confused. Grace, how do you know medical terminology? Grace felt walls closing in. I read online articles, she lied. I care about Alexander. She's been reading WebMD and thinks she's a doctor. Dr. Pemberton dripped contempt. This is exactly why we don't allow staff near the boy. Victoria moved close to James, hand on his arm. Darling, she's obsessed with our son. This is grounds for immediate termination and restraining order. James studied Grace for a long moment. Grace, I appreciate your concern, but you've overstepped. Please restrict yourself to housekeeping duties. Grace bowed her head. Yes, sir. She gathered her supplies and turned to leave. As she passed the examination table, Alexander's hands moved in quick gestures. American Sign Language. Please, he signed. Help me. Grace's heart shattered. That evening in the kitchen, Maria set down her knife when she saw Grace's face. Mija, you almost got fired. Why risk everything? Grace checked the doorway was empty. That boy is suffering. Victoria is hiding something. What you mean? Grace showed Maria the photographs on her flip phone. Ivermectin bottles, journal entries, medical refusals. Maria made the sign of the cross. Dios mío. But Grace, you're just a maid. What can you do? Grace's hands trembled. Maria, if I tell you something, you must never repeat it. Maria nodded. My real name is Dr. Grace Monroe. I was chief of pediatric surgery at Johns Hopkins. I performed 3,000 surgeries on children. They called me the child whisperer because I never lost a patient. Maria's eyes widened. Until I lost my own son, Grace continued, voice breaking. Emergency tracheotomy at home. My hands shook. I cut it wrong. He bled out in my arms. The medical board destroyed me. I came here to disappear. But I can't watch another child die. Maria took Grace's hands in her own. Then you don't disappear. You fight. If I expose myself, Victoria will sue me for fraud, practicing without a license. If you do nothing, Maria interrupts fiercely, that boy dies. You think you can live with that? Grace closed her eyes. I need to examine Alexander. Alone. Maria thought for a moment. The gala dinner tomorrow night. Mrs. Victoria will be busy with donors. I can distract the staff. Maybe 30 minutes. Grace nodded. 30 minutes is all I need. But at 10 o'clock that night, Victoria summoned Grace to her private study. Victoria sat behind an antique desk, wine glass in hand, manila folder in the other. The room smelled of old books and expensive perfume. Close the door, Victoria said. Grace obeyed. Victoria sipped wine slowly, eyes never leaving Grace's face. I've been doing research on you, or should I say, Dr. Grace Monroe. The floor dropped away. Yes, Victoria continued, smile sharp. I know exactly who you are. Former child whisperer, current child killer, your son David. Such a tragic story. You failed the one surgery that mattered. Grace's hands clenched. How did you... I make it my business to know everything about people in my home. Victoria opened the folder, spreading photographs across the desk. Newspaper clippings, medical board documents, David's death certificate. Here's what's going to happen. You will never mention Alexander's care again. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will remain invisible. Because if you don't... Victoria slid a document forward. I will send this dossier to every medical board, every news outlet, every social media platform. I will make sure the world remembers Dr. Grace Monroe as the butcher who killed her own child. I will destroy whatever pathetic life you've built, Grace whispered. Why are you doing this? Victoria leaned back, savoring the moment. Because I can. Because people like you, immigrants, has-beens, failures, need to understand their place. You exist to serve people like me. Now get out. Grace turned to leave, legs unsteady, vision blurred with rage. But as she reached the door, she heard Victoria pick up her phone. "Dr. Pemberton," Victoria said, tone urgent. "It's me. I need you to call back about expediting the timeline. We should consider stopping the medication next year instead of 2034. I know, but circumstances changed. Just make it look natural. Call me tomorrow." Grace stood frozen, hand on the doorknob. Stopping what medication? Expediting what timeline? Make what look natural? Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. The ivermectin, the 5-year pattern, the refusal of imaging tests, the timeline to inheritance. Victoria wasn't just keeping Alexander deaf. She was keeping him alive just long enough to make his death look like an accident. The gala began at 8 the following evening. Grace watched from the kitchen as 50 donors filled the grand hall, their laughter echoing off marble columns while a string quartet played Vivaldi. Victoria moved through the crowd in her emerald dress, smile practiced and perfect. Maria squeezed Grace's shoulder. Now, everyone's distracted. 30 minutes before staff rotation. Grace slipped up the servants' staircase, heart hammering. Alexander's bedroom was on the 3rd floor, far from the party. She'd stolen an otoscope from the medical wing that afternoon. The boy's door was unlocked. Alexander sat in his window seat reading by lamplight. When Grace entered, he looked startled. Then his hands moved. "Who are you?" Grace signed back, her ASL rusty. "My name is Grace. I'm a doctor. I want to help you." Alexander's eyes widened. "You know sign language?" Grace nodded. "Will you trust me?" The boy studied her face, then nodded. "Your ear hurts," Grace signed. "Every day." Alexander's expression crumbled. "Yes. But Victoria says I'm imagining it. Phantom pain from nerve damage. May I look?" Alexander hesitated, then nodded. Grace pulled out the otoscope, turned on its light, gently inserted it into Alexander's right ear. She adjusted the angle, peering through the lens. What she saw made her breath stop. 8 millimeters deep in the ear canal, partially obscured by inflamed tissue, was a small, dark opening. Moving, pulsing, contracting and expanding in steady rhythm. A posterior spiracle, a breathing hole. Something was alive in there. Grace withdrew the otoscope slowly. "There's something living in your ear. A parasite. Been there for years." Alexander's hands trembled. "A bug?" Grace nodded. "A larva. It's eating your tissue and blocking your hearing. But I can remove it. Will it hurt?" "Yes. But not as much as 5 more years of this." Alexander's next question came slowly, fingers forming each letter with terrible certainty. "Victoria put it there, didn't she?" Grace felt ice water flood her veins. "What makes you say that?" Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "I remember. I was 3. Brazil. Sleeping in the hotel. Something landed on my face, crawling. I woke up crying. Victoria stood over my bed. She said, 'Shh, just a dream, go back to sleep.' But I saw her face. She was smiling." Grace pulled the boy into her arms and held him. After Alexander slept, Grace went to the library parking lot and accessed their Wi-Fi. She searched botfly larvae, Dermatobia hominis, human myiasis cases in Brazil. Read about life cycle, symptoms, treatment protocols. Then I searched for ivermectin usage in parasite maintenance. The veterinary journals were clear. Low-dose ivermectin administered regularly could keep parasitic larvae alive indefinitely while preventing full maturity. Used in research to study parasites without killing specimens. Victoria hadn't been treating the infection. She'd been preserving it. Grace pulled up the timeline. In March 2019, Alexander was infected in Brazil at 3. 5 years of ivermectin keeps the larva alive but small, blocking the ear canal enough to cause deafness but not life-threatening infection. Victoria's plan was to stop medication in 2034 when Alexander turned 18. But Victoria just moved that timeline to next year. What happens when ivermectin stops? The larva grows rapidly, reaching full maturity in weeks. At 25 millimeters, it ruptures through tissue, causing massive infection, septic shock, organ failure, death, looking completely natural. Undiagnosed parasitic infection. No foul play. Just a grieving widow inheriting $500 million. Grace stared at medical images of bot fly extraction procedures. She made her decision. She couldn't wait. Couldn't gather more evidence. Couldn't go through proper channels because Victoria would destroy her first. She would expose Victoria tomorrow night at the gala, in front of witnesses, on camera. Extract that larva from Alexander's ear before 50 of New York's wealthiest families and 2 million live stream viewers. It was insane. Dangerous. Would expose her identity and destroy whatever anonymity remained. But it was the only way to save that child's life. Grace closed her laptop and looked at David's photograph on her nightstand. "I couldn't save you," she whispered. "But I can save him." Grace Monroe entered the Grand Hall at 8:15, exactly 15 minutes after Victoria's opening speech began. She wore her gray maid's uniform and carried a medical bag she'd assembled from supplies stolen over the past week. 50 guests sat at round tables draped in white linen, their faces turned toward the stage where Victoria stood bathed in the spotlight. Maria caught Grace's eye from the kitchen entrance and gave a small nod. The distraction was in place. Victoria's voice filled the room through the sound system, honey-sweet and practiced. "And that's why the Sterling Foundation for Deaf Children means so much to me personally. My stepson Alexander has taught me that disabilities don't define us, they—" Grace walked straight down the center aisle. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "A maid," someone said. "What's she doing?" Victoria's eyes found Grace, and for one fraction of a second Grace saw pure panic flash across that perfect face before the mask returned. "Security!" Victoria called out, her voice sharp. "Remove this woman." But Grace had already reached the stage. She climbed the 3 steps, crossed to the podium, and took the microphone from Victoria's hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grace said, her voice steady and clear. "My name is Dr. Grace Monroe. I have an urgent medical announcement about Alexander Sterling." Chaos erupted. Security guards started moving through the crowd. Guests pulled out their phones. Someone started a live stream. James Sterling's face appeared on the massive video screen behind the stage, his video call from Tokyo suddenly the center of attention. "Wait," he said, his voice booming through the speakers. "The Dr. Grace Monroe? The child whisperer from Johns Hopkins?" Victoria's face had gone pale. "James, she's an imposter. She's our maid. She's mentally—" Grace cut her off. "Mr. Sterling, I was chief of pediatric surgery at Johns Hopkins. I gave up my career after a tragic mistake 5 years ago. I've been working in your home for 6 months under an assumed name. But tonight, I cannot stay silent anymore." The room had gone completely still. 50 faces stared at Grace. The live stream counter on someone's phone showed the number climbing. 2,000 viewers, 5,000, 10,000. Grace continued. 6 months ago, 5 of America's most respected doctors held a press conference. They declared that your son Alexander would never hear again. Irreversible nerve damage, they said. No treatment available. She turned to face the camera someone had pointed at the stage. They were wrong. Not because they lack skill, but because they were examining the wrong diagnosis. Your son doesn't have nerve damage. He has a parasitic infection that has been deliberately maintained for 5 years. And I can prove it right now. The room exploded. Dr. Pemberton jumped to his feet. "This is insanity. I've examined that boy dozens of times." Grace's eyes found him in the crowd. "Then why have you never performed a tympanometry test, doctor? Why have you refused every CT scan, Mrs. Sterling suggested?" Pemberton opened his mouth, closed it. "I didn't refuse." Victoria said. Victoria lunged toward Grace, but 2 men in dark suits moved to intercept her. "FBI," one of them said quietly. "Detective Sarah Morrison. Please stay where you are, Mrs. Sterling." Grace pulled out her phone and held it up. I have photographs. Mrs. Sterling's private journal documenting her plan. Veterinary prescriptions for antiparasitic medication spanning 5 years. Travel records from Brazil matching the infection timeline. Medical refusal letters. And if you allow me, Mr. Sterling, I can extract the parasite from Alexander's ear right now, on camera, in front of everyone. Victoria's voice rose to a scream. You're not touching my son! James Sterling's face on the screen had gone hard. He's my son. Dr. Monroe, do it. Now. Staff brought Alexander from the garden where he'd been waiting with his tutor. The boy saw Grace, and his face lit up with hope and terror mixed together. Maria helped clear a dining table, laying down sterile sheets. Grace knelt beside Alexander as he climbed onto the makeshift examination table. The room had gone silent. Every phone was recording. The live stream counter read 2.4 million viewers. Grace signed to Alexander. Ready to hear the world again? Alexander's hands trembled. Will it hurt? Yes, for 60 seconds. But then music, birds, your father's voice. Worth it? Alexander nodded. Worth it. Grace turned to address the crowd, her voice clear and clinical. What you're about to witness is the extraction of a Dermatobia hominis larva, a human botfly larva native to Central and South America, particularly Brazil. She connected the otoscope to the projection system. The image of Alexander's ear canal appeared on the massive screen behind her, magnified 40 times. The crowd gasped. Inflamed red tissue, yellow discharge, and there, unmistakable, a small dark hole pulsing rhythmically. Grace used a laser pointer. That pulsing hole is the posterior spiracle. The larva's breathing apparatus. How it gets oxygen while buried in human tissue. It's been breathing inside Alexander's ear for 5 years. A woman in the front row put her hand over her mouth. Oh my God, it's breathing! Grace pulled out a jar of petroleum jelly. The extraction technique is called occlusive therapy. I'll cover the spiracle, cutting off the oxygen supply. When it can't breathe, survival instinct forces it to back out for air. Then I extract it with surgical forceps. James Sterling's voice came through the speakers. Grace, if you fail... Grace looked directly at the camera. I won't fail, Mr. Sterling. I've done this before. Trust me. She applied thick petroleum jelly to Alexander's ear canal, sealing it completely. The timer started. The room held its breath. 10 seconds. Nothing. 20 seconds. Alexander winced. It's moving. Grace kept her voice soothing. That's good. Stay very still. 30 seconds. On the projection screen, the tissue began to bulge. 40 seconds. The bulge grew. Something white emerging. Someone in the crowd screamed. 50 seconds. A segmented white body pushed through the jelly. 60 seconds. The larva was halfway out, its posterior end visible, brown spiracles opening and closing, desperately seeking air. Grace picked up the surgical forceps. Her hands were completely steady. No tremor. No hesitation. I'm extracting now. She inserted the forceps, gripped the larva's posterior segment, and began to pull. Slow. Controlled. On the screen, everyone watched the white segmented body emerge millimeter by millimeter. 5 millimeters, 7 millimeters, 10 millimeters. The larva's head emerged, brown with tiny black mouthparts and hooks still gripping tissue. Grace pulled it completely free. She held it up with the forceps under the stage lights. A fat white larva, 12 millimeters long, wriggling violently in the air, its segmented body contracting and expanding, spiracles opening and closing, covered in Alexander's blood and tissue. Dead silence. Then a woman fainted. A man vomited into his napkin. Phones zoomed frantically. Someone was crying. Grace placed the larva in a clear specimen jar and held it up to the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the reason Alexander Sterling has been deaf for 5 years. The larva writhed inside the jar, pressing against the glass. Grace's voice remained clinical. Notice the larva is only 12 millimeters. Normal maturity is 20 to 25 millimeters. This one has been chemically stunted. She held up the ivermectin bottle. Using this, veterinary-grade antiparasitic. Low doses keep the larva alive but prevent full development. James Sterling's face filled with horror. You're saying Victoria was feeding that thing? No, Mr. Sterling. She was preserving it, keeping it small enough not to kill your son immediately, but large enough to keep him deaf. Alexander touched his ear, confused. It feels empty. Grace smiled. It is empty, for the first time in 5 years. Then Alexander's eyes went wide. He turned toward the string quartet that had been playing softly in the corner throughout the entire procedure. I hear the music, he whispered. Then louder. I hear the music. I can hear. He looked at the screen where his father's face was streaming with tears. Daddy, Alexander said out loud, his voice garbled but unmistakable. I love you, Daddy. The room exploded. Applause thundered. People were hugging strangers, crying. The live stream comments scrolled too fast to read. But Grace was watching Victoria. Victoria Sterling stood perfectly still, her face a mask of rage. Then she started laughing, high-pitched, manic. You want the truth? Victoria screamed at the cameras. Fine. Yes, I infected that brat. Yes, I kept it alive 5 years. You know why? Because I earned that money. 5 years playing stepmother to a child I never wanted. That $500 million was my payment. Detective Morrison stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Mrs. Sterling, you're confessing to attempted murder on live stream with 2.4 million witnesses. Victoria's face went blank. She'd destroyed herself with her own arrogance. As they led her away in handcuffs, she was still screaming. It should have been mine. The grand hall descended into controlled chaos. Security managed the crowd. Reporters shouted questions. The live stream counter topped 3 million. James Sterling's voice cut through the noise from the video screen. Dr. Monroe. Grace. Why did you hide who you were? Grace stood beside Alexander, her hand on his shoulder. 50 pairs of eyes pressed down on her. 3 million more watched through screens. She'd spent 5 years running from this moment. Because I didn't deserve to be a doctor anymore. The room quieted. December 14th, 2019. My son David was 12. Severe peanut allergy. Anaphylactic shock at home from a hidden cashew. I performed an emergency tracheotomy. Done it 200 times on other children. She paused. But David was mine. My hands shook. I cut too deep, severed his carotid artery. He bled out in my arms in 90 seconds. Silence. The medical board ruled gross negligence. They were right. I had tools, expertise, 15 years of experience. But not steadiness. Because he was mine. Because I loved him too much to save him. Alexander wrapped his arms around Grace's waist. You saved me. Grace looked down, tears spilling. You saved me too, Alexander. James leaned closer to his camera. How did you figure it out? How did you know what 5 specialists missed? Grace wiped her eyes. 3 things, Mr. Sterling. First, truly deaf children don't track conversations with their eyes like Alexander does. He was reading lips constantly, adapting. That's not acceptance. That's someone trapped. Second, veterinary ivermectin in Mrs. Sterling's bathroom. Antiparasitic refilled for 5 years. Why would a child with nerve damage need antiparasitics? Third, Brazil. Botflies are endemic there. I've treated 2 cases, both travelers from that region. Mrs. Sterling's travel records from March 2019 matched Alexander's deafness timeline perfectly. Dr. Pemberton stood, face ashen. I trusted her. She controlled every appointment, every test. I never suspected. Grace's eyes found him. You trusted without verifying, doctor. That's not medicine. That's negligence. Pemberton sat heavily. I'll resign immediately. James's voice was hard. No. You'll testify against Victoria. Then resign. The screen split. 4 more faces appeared. Dr. Hayes, Dr. Morrison, Dr. Wu, Dr. Klein. The original medical panel. Dr. Hayes spoke first, voice heavy with shame. Dr. Monroe, 6 months ago, we declared this boy would never hear. We were catastrophically wrong. Doctor. Klein added, I said never, with 30 years' experience. A maid with a stolen otoscope proved me wrong. Dr. Morrison's voice was quiet. We trusted the parent, never considered deliberate sabotage. Dr. Hayes continued, We'll submit a formal recommendation for your full license reinstatement. We'll personally sponsor your return to practice. Grace shook her head. Thank you, but that's not why I did this. Then why? Dr. Hayes asked. Grace looked at Alexander. Because I failed my own son, and I couldn't watch another child die when I had knowledge to prevent it. That's not about licenses or redemption. That's about responsibility. James filled the screen. Dr. Monroe, I'm revoking any legal liability. I'm also offering you family physician position. Name your price. Alexander tugged Grace's sleeve. Please stay, he signed. Maria appeared at Grace's side, smiling through tears. You see, mija? You were meant to fight. Grace looked around. At 50 witnesses. At cameras. At the jar containing the larva. At Alexander hearing his father's voice for the first time. She'd come here to hide. Instead, she'd confronted her past in front of 3 million people. And survived. All right, Grace said quietly. I'll stay. The room erupted in applause. Grace barely heard it. She was watching Alexander's face, his joy experiencing sound after 5 years of silence. David would have been 17 now, and Grace knew her son would have been proud. 30 minutes after the extraction, Grace was kneeling beside Alexander in the medical wing when the boy's breathing changed. His hand went to his throat. His eyes widened in panic. Grace's medical training kicked in instantly. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, feeling his pulse race. His lips were already turning pale. Anaphylactic shock. The larva had released toxins when it was extracted. Alexander, look at me, Grace commanded. The boy's eyes found hers. You're going into shock. I need to open your airway. Do you trust me? Alexander nodded. Then his body convulsed. Dr. Pemberton rushed in with his medical bag. We need epinephrine, intubation equipment, ambulance. There's no time, Grace cut him off. We do this here. Now. Maria appeared in the doorway. Grace, your hands. You said they shake during emergencies. Grace looked down at her trembling hands. The tremor was already starting. She could feel David's blood on them, see his eyes going blank, hear her own screaming. Alexander's lips were turning blue. James Sterling's voice came through someone's phone. Grace, please. I can't lose him. Grace closed her eyes. The flashback hit like a freight train. David's face turning purple, her hands fumbling with the scalpel, blood spraying across the kitchen tiles, his small body going limp in her arms, the sound of her own voice begging him to breathe. Please breathe. Please. Grace. Maria's voice cut through the nightmare. Grace snapped her eyes open. Alexander was dying in front of her. Right now, just like David. Maria, Grace said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Hold my wrist. What? Traditional Chinese surgical technique. The master's hand guides the students. Hold my wrist tight. Be my anchor. Maria gripped Grace's right wrist with both hands, her calloused fingers strong and sure. Grace took a breath. Scalpel. Dr. Pemberton placed the sterile scalpel in her palm. The metal felt cold and familiar. Grace positioned it over Alexander's throat, finding the cricothyroid membrane by touch. Her hand shook. Maria's grip tightened. "I got you, mija." Grace pressed the blade to skin. Her hand trembled. She saw David's face, heard his choking, felt his blood. No. Grace closed her eyes and whispered to her son's spirit, "David, if you can hear me, guide my hand. Help me save him." Maria's grip was steel. "Steady," she murmured. "You got this." Grace's hand stopped shaking. She made the incision. Clean, precise, exactly the right depth. Blood welled but didn't spray. She inserted the tube into the opening, one smooth motion, and air rushed into Alexander's lungs. The boy's lips went from blue to pink. He gasped, coughed, breathed. Grace collapsed forward, her forehead against the examination table, sobbing. "Thank you, David. Thank you." The room erupted in applause for the second time that night. But Grace barely heard it. She was crying too hard. The FBI forensics laboratory in Manhattan smelled like chemicals and cold metal. Detective Sarah Morrison had rushed the larva specimen there immediately after Victoria's arrest. Grace and James Sterling arrived at dawn, neither having slept. A forensic entomologist named Dr. Patricia Wells held the specimen jar up to ultraviolet light. "Fascinating," she murmured. "This is no ordinary botfly larva." Grace stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Dr. Wells pointed to small fluorescent spots visible under the UV light. "See these blue markers? That's a tracking dye used in entomological research. This larva came from a controlled laboratory environment." Detective Morrison leaned in. "Can you trace it?" Dr. Wells nodded. "The dye signature is unique to each facility. This one matches Biogen Labs in Rio de Janeiro. They were shut down in 2020 for illegal human experimentation." Grace felt ice in her veins. So Victoria bought this deliberately. Morrison pulled out a laptop. "We subpoenaed Mrs. Sterling's financial records overnight. She paid $50,000 to a consultant in Brazil on March 2, 2019, 2 weeks before the family vacation. She showed Grace the email trail. Victoria had written, 'Need slow-acting, undetectable method. Child must appear naturally ill.' Timeline, 15 years. The consultant's response, Dermatobia hominis larva, genetically marked for tracking, administered during sleep. Maintain low-dose ivermectin. The subject will be deaf but functional. Cessation of medication will result in rapid growth, tissue rupture, septic shock, death. Will appear as an undiagnosed parasitic infection. Untraceable." James Sterling's face had gone white. "She planned this from the beginning." Morrison opened another file. "We found her encrypted journal. The digital one she thought was secure. Entry from your wedding night, Mr. Sterling. Phase 1, marriage complete. Phase 2, eliminate children. Phase 3, widow's fortune. Estimated timeline, 15 years. She paid for this 2 weeks before we went to Brazil," James said, his voice hollow. "She ensured his death before she even infected him." Morrison slid a document across the table. Life insurance policy on Alexander Sterling. $10 million. Beneficiary, Victoria Sterling. Dated March 8, 2019. Grace stared at the date. 6 days before the Brazil trip. Dr. Wells cleared her throat. "There's something else. The genetic marking on this larva indicates it came from a batch of 14 specimens, all sold to different clients in March 2019. Morrison's head snapped up. 14? 14 larvae. 14 clients. All purchased within the same 2-week period. Grace's stomach dropped. There are 13 other children. Morrison was already on her phone. "I need a federal warrant for Biogen Labs client records. Yes, I know they're in Brazil. Get the Ministry of Health involved. Now. James grabbed Morrison's arm. Those children could be dying right now. I know, Morrison said grimly. But Biogen destroyed their records when they shut down. The only way to get client names is if Mrs. Sterling cooperates. Grace and Morrison sat in the FBI interrogation room watching Victoria through one-way glass. The woman sat perfectly still in her orange jumpsuit, her lawyer whispering in her ear. Morrison entered the room. Mrs. Sterling, we know about the 14 other children. Victoria's expression didn't change. I want full immunity. You live stream confessed to attempted murder. What immunity? Victoria leaned forward. Biogen Labs had 14 clients in March 2019, all wealthy step-parents, all wanting inconvenient children gone. I have names, addresses, documentation. Morrison's voice was steel. Give us the names. Victoria smiled. Full immunity, presidential pardon, witness protection, or those children stay infected until they die. Your choice, detective. Grace stood up in the observation room. She can't be serious. Morrison came back out, her face grim. Biogen destroyed their records. She's our only lead. Grace pulled out her phone. No, she's not. Grace dialed a number she'd memorized days ago. A woman answered in Portuguese. This is Dr. Grace Monroe calling from New York. I need to speak with someone at the Brazilian Ministry of Health about Biogen Labs regulatory filings. The woman switched to English. Biogen was shut down for violations. All records were destroyed. Grace smiled. But they filed quarterly reports with your ministry. That's federal law in Brazil. Those reports list client reference numbers for specimen sales. Even if Biogen destroyed their copies, you have yours. A pause. Yes. We have reports going back 5 years. Client reference numbers can be decoded using financial wire transfer timestamps. The FBI has Victoria Sterling's wire transfer from March 2019. If you cross-reference the timestamp with your quarterly report from that period, you can identify the reference number assigned to her purchase. Then you can identify the other 13 reference numbers from the same batch. Another pause. You're correct. Give me 1 hour. Grace hung up and walked back into the interrogation room. Victoria's face fell when she saw Grace's expression. We don't need your confession, Grace said quietly. The Brazilian Ministry of Health has Biogen's regulatory reports. They're decoding the client reference numbers right now. By tomorrow morning, the FBI will have all 14 names. Victoria's lawyer started to protest, but Victoria waved him silent. She stared at Grace with pure hatred. You should have stayed in your place. Grace leaned across the table. I'm a doctor. My place is saving children's lives, even from monsters like you. By the next morning, FBI field teams had identified 12 of the 14 families. They found 11 children still alive, larvae extracted in emergency procedures across 6 states. 3 children had already died in the past year. Their deaths ruled as natural causes until forensic exhumation revealed the truth. Grace stood in the FBI Operations Center watching the names appear on the screen. An 8-year-old girl in Connecticut who'd been diagnosed with autism. A 12-year-old boy in California with unexplained learning disabilities. A 16-year-old in Florida who'd been preparing for hospice care. All of them had the same travel history. Brazil, March 2019. And all of them had step-parents with access to large inheritances. Detective Morrison ended a phone call and turned to Grace. All 11 surviving children are in stable condition. Larvae successfully extracted. They're all going to live. Grace felt her legs give out. She sat down hard in an office chair. 11 children. 11 lives. Morrison sat beside her. You saved them, Dr. Monroe. Victoria's confession gave us the timeline. Your phone call gave us the names. Those children are alive because of you. Grace shook her head. They're alive because I refused to let them become David. 1 week after the gala, Grace found Alexander sitting in the Sterling estate garden wearing temporary hearing aids while his ear healed. He was listening to birds sing, his face lit with wonder at sounds most people took for granted. Grace brought him tea and sat beside him on the stone bench. "Grace," Alexander said, his voice still adjusting to speaking aloud, "can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why did you give up being a doctor, even after your son died?" Grace watched a cardinal land on the fountain's edge. "Because I thought I didn't deserve to save lives after I took one. I thought the best thing I could do was disappear and never hurt anyone again. But you didn't disappear." Grace smiled. "No. Because you taught me something, Alexander." "What?" "That redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about honoring it. I couldn't save David. But because I loved him so deeply, I learned to recognize when a child needs saving. You were that child." Alexander leaned against her shoulder. "Will you stay? My dad wants you to be our family doctor. I'm not licensed anymore." James Sterling emerged from the house, overhearing. "Already in motion, Dr. Monroe. A medical board hearing is scheduled for next month. Every major hospital in the country is writing recommendations. You'll have your license back by Christmas." Alexander looked up at Grace with pleading eyes. "Say yes, please." Grace felt something break open in her chest, something that had been locked tight for 5 years. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." 2 months later, Grace stood in a federal courthouse as Judge Patricia Carter read Victoria Sterling's sentence. The courtroom was packed with families of the 11 surviving children. "Victoria Sterling, you have been found guilty of attempted murder, child endangerment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and filing false insurance claims. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." Victoria's face remained emotionless. "I'd do it again," she said flatly. Judge Carter's eyes hardened. Furthermore, 14 children were identified in this conspiracy. 11 survived due to Dr. Grace Monroe's intervention. 3 died before they could be reached. Their families are filing wrongful death lawsuits against you. You will never see daylight as a free woman again." Victoria was led away in handcuffs. Outside the courthouse, Detective Morrison addressed the press. "This case represents the largest child endangerment conspiracy in United States history. Dr. Grace Monroe's courage saved 11 innocent lives." James Sterling stepped to the podium. "The Sterling Foundation is funding a new initiative, the Grace Monroe Center for Child Advocacy, dedicated to protecting vulnerable children from medical neglect and abuse." The crowd applauded. Grace stood off to the side, uncomfortable with the attention. But Alexander found her hand and squeezed it tight, and she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. 6 months after the trial, Grace Monroe stood in her new office wearing a white coat for the first time in 5 years. The brass nameplate on the door read Monroe Pediatric Practice. Sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking Central Park. Her first patient of the day was a 7-year-old girl with an ear infection. Grace examined her gently, thoroughly, taking time to explain every step to both the child and her mother. She prescribed antibiotics and scheduled a follow-up in 1 week. The second patient was a 10-year-old boy with hearing loss. Grace ordered comprehensive tests, tympanometry, CT scan, blood work. She would never miss another diagnosis. Ever. Alexander arrived after school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Grace, can I help?" Grace smiled. "What would you like to do? Tell other kids they're not alone. Kids who are deaf or sick or scared. You'd be amazing at that." Alexander started a YouTube channel called Alexander's Journey. He shared his story in sign language with subtitles, talking about the 5 years he spent trapped in silence and the doctor who refused to let him stay there. Within 3 months, he had 2 million subscribers. Within 6 months, he'd become a national advocate for child abuse prevention, testifying before Congress about medical neglect. Maria appeared in Grace's office doorway, now serving as office manager. "Dr. Monroe, we have 53 new patient requests today, all from families who saw the news coverage." Grace looked at her appointment book, already filled for the next 2 months. "Tell them we'll see every single one." That weekend, James Sterling hosted a reunion at the estate for the 11 families whose children had been saved. Kids ranging from 6 to 16 years old ran through the gardens, playing together, laughing, living. Grace watched from the terrace as parents gathered around her. A mother from Connecticut approached first. "My daughter was diagnosed autistic at 4. 4 years of speech therapy, behavioral intervention, special schools. Then the FBI showed up and pulled a larva from her ear. She's not autistic. She was just deaf. Her stepfather's new wife did it. A father from California joined them. My son's stepmom told us he had a brain tumor. We were planning his funeral. Then your phone call saved his life." A grandmother from Florida, her voice breaking. "We never suspected. She seemed so devoted, so loving. How do you learn to trust again after that?" Grace took the woman's hands. "You learn by celebrating what you have now. These children are alive. They're thriving. That's what matters." The 11 children found Grace on the lawn and surrounded her in a group hug. "You're like a superhero," a 6-year-old boy said. Grace laughed through tears. "No, sweetheart, I'm just a mom who lost her child and refused to let it happen to anyone else." That evening, Dr. Robert Hayes gave the keynote address at a medical conference in Boston. "The Sterling case taught us a humbling lesson," he told the audience of 500 physicians. 5 of us with 150 years of combined experience declared a child would never hear. We were catastrophically wrong. Why? Because we trusted the parents. We trusted the medical history. We never considered deliberate sabotage. Dr. Grace Monroe, who lost her license after a tragic mistake, did what we couldn't. She questioned everything. Grace sat in the audience as he spoke. When Dr. Hayes recognized her, the entire conference rose in standing ovation. Dr. Catherine Morrison approached the microphone next. "I was one of the doctors who said, 'Never.' I was wrong. Dr. Monroe proved that medical certainty can become medical arrogance. From this day forward, we question everything. That is Dr. Monroe's legacy to our profession." Grace knelt at David's grave on a Sunday afternoon, placing fresh flowers beside his headstone. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the cemetery. She heard footsteps behind her. "Hey, baby," Grace said softly. "I brought someone to meet you." Alexander sat beside her on the grass, quiet and respectful. "This is David," Grace said. "He would be 17 now. He would be so proud of you." "I wish I could have met him," Alexander sighed. "In a way, you did. Every time I looked at you, I saw him. That's why I couldn't walk away." Grace's voice shifted, becoming the narrator's voice that had guided this story from the beginning. "People often ask me if I've forgiven myself for David's death. The answer is no. I don't think I ever will. But I've learned that forgiveness isn't the goal. The purpose is." Victoria Sterling thought wealth and status put her above justice, but she underestimated one thing: the unstoppable force of a mother's love, even when that mother has lost her own child. 11 children are alive today because I refused to let grief silence me. That's not redemption. That's my responsibility. If you're watching this and you've experienced loss, tragedy, or failure, don't let it end your story. Let it become the reason you fight for someone else's story. The world is full of Victorias, people who harm the vulnerable because they think no one is watching. But there are more of us, people who've been broken and rebuilt. We are the witnesses, the protectors, the ones who refuse to look away. Be that person. Save a life, even if you couldn't save your own. Text appeared on screen. Inspired by true events. Every year, 300,000 children are victims of medical neglect or abuse in the United States. If you suspect a child is in danger, call the National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-4-A-CHILD. Grace looked directly into the camera. Thank you for watching Alexander's story. If it moved you, please share it. If you know a child who needs help, speak up. And if you've ever felt that your past disqualifies you from doing good in this world, you're wrong. Your scars make you the perfect warrior. Leave a comment below. What is your purpose? How will you protect the vulnerable? Subscribe for more stories of courage, justice, and redemption. And remember this: you are not too broken to be a hero. The final image showed Grace, Alexander, and the 11 rescued children standing together in golden sunlight, smiling, alive, free. Text faded in. The Silent Conspiracy. A story of pain, purpose, and the power of refusing to stay silent. The screen faded to black,